Chapter 26. Skirmish. Time seemed to slow down as the arrows swarmed to their targets. There were many spells that the prepared mage could cast to block them or swat them out of the air. The mages were caught by surprise though. They hadn't expected the barrier to collapse when it did. Many of them were standing around looking stunned for a second or two before the arrows hit them. The air was filled with the sound of heavy thuds. First the sounds of arrows striking hard into the flesh of their targets, and then the sounds of the mages hitting the ground. Many still wearing expressions of both surprise and disbelief. Race would like to have been sure that his was the arrow that had killed the alderman he had targeted, but he wasn't. The man had fallen with over a dozen arrows protruding from his torso, and Race's was just one of them. It seemed he wasn't the only one eager to be able to declare a kill. "That's one," one of his huntresses commented. "I got one too," another of his girls mentioned. "That was my kill," a third grumbled. There seemed to be a lot of general chatter among the gathered huntresses, but the battle wasn't over yet. Behind the line of mages were the Inquisitor's bodyguards, and with their wards dead, they advanced slowly on the harpies as if they had nothing to lose. Behind them were no fewer than 2 regiments of regular elven infantry, and a 3rd regiment of elven archers. Race looked at the ranks of the enemy soldiers for only a moment. The mages had been the biggest danger, and he had given little thought to those standing behind them. With the mages dead, the biggest threat to his huntresses had to be the archers. Race suddenly barked out an order. "Fly!" "My chief?" Quinnigoff questioned. "Fly!" Race repeated the order. "Let's get back to the others." Without another word, Race took to the air. He flew as fast as his wings could carry him. Race's 4 bodyguards quickly took up positions surrounding him. Race knew that had they wanted to, his bodyguards could fly almost double his speed. But they stayed with him, keeping to his slow pace and forming a kind of shield of flesh about him. Then the elven archers fired. Their arrows struck in hard against the fast-forming flock of harpies. Many were cut down before they even managed to take to the air. Race looked around in a panic for a moment, wondering where Gagawa was, hoping she hadn't been amongst those hit. He saw her flying not too far away from where he was, and like his bodyguards, she was keeping pace with him. "Climb!" Race ordered. "Let's make it as difficult as possible for their archers." "Then we hit back," Tanegi suggested keenly. "Then we hit—" "Yah!" Race yelled suddenly. Something cold and clammy suddenly wrapped itself around both of his legs, and then, without ceremony, he found himself being dragged down to the ground. He turned over to see what had grabbed him, and saw a thick brown tendril covered in small black liver spots and tiny fins that might have been better suited to water. Race tried to see the source of the tendril and saw one of the Inquisitors on the other end of it. The mage looked quite well, having not so much as a single arrow sticking out of his body. The Inquisitor bore the insignia of a dragon man, and quite reasonably, he didn't seem to be in the mood for pulling his punches. When he twisted in the air to get a better look at what had grabbed him, Race had so changed his position that when he hit the ground, he landed on his back. His wings and tail were immediately crushed beneath his body. His head was thrown back hard and it struck the ground. He was still conscious, but felt more than a little bit dizzy. Somewhere, he thought he heard a harpy cry out, "Our male is in danger! Attack!" Perhaps it was just wishful thinking. Race would rather his girls made it to safety and forgot about him, as if he hadn't already suffered enough. Race was then dragged through the dirt. No fresh snow had settled since the painting had been activated, so the drag was a lot less comfortable than it otherwise might have been. His tail hurt, but at least it seemed to be in one piece. The same couldn't be said about his wings. They had bent at an awkward angle, and he could hear the bones breaking like twigs. Pain shuddered through his body with each snap as his damaged wings were dragged without ceremony through the rough dirt. The pain became all but unbearable, and Race slipped to the very edge of consciousness. He wasn't sure, but he thought he could hear more worried cries from his huntresses. "Chief!" That sounded like Heshkov's voice. "We'll save you, boss!" This one almost had to be Tanegi. Race's bodyguards weren't the only ones who wanted to rescue their male. Race had no clue as to how many of his girls had survived the elven archers, but he felt sure that every one of them had attacked. From how he lay, Race couldn't see much of what was happening. He could hear arrows being fired by the elven archers, and the heavy thuds as more of his girls were plucked out of the sky. To Race, the battle seemed to be being fought in the realm of sound. Slowly, Race was dragged through a tunnel of elven Inquisitor bodyguards. The first pair paid no heed to him whatsoever. Instead, they stood steadfast behind their massive shields, using them to protect themselves and their one remaining mage. From what Race could see of those shields, they were being put to good use. Already they had blocked a fair number of arrows. The others, though, seemed to be much less willing to let Race pass without some kind of retribution. They kicked him hard, some of them stamping down on his chest. Race thought he heard a few of his ribs snap, but he was already in too much pain to notice much different. Shortly, Race found himself lying directly in front of the Dragon Man. The tentacle released his legs and returned to become the Mage's arm. Race lay there hopeless, every muscle and every nerve in his body crying out in pain. He could move, but only a little, and he felt very uncertain that he would be able to do anything to protect himself in this situation. "Hurting, Harpy?" the Dragon Man commented, stepping to Race's side to get a closer look at his prisoner. "Trust me, you don't know the meaning of the word. Not yet. But you will. You slaughtered almost my entire regiment, and I want to know why. You're their male, so I hold you personally responsible." "Tired," Race commented, only half lucidly. He looked weakly at the mage and tried to smile. For a moment he considered summoning his sword and trying to fight his way out of here. Right now, though, he doubted he could even lift his sword, let alone wield it. The Dragon Man laughed. "Yes, I'm sure you'd love to sleep right now. Sleep away all those little aches and pains." He placed a foot on part of Race's wing that was protruding from under Race. He didn't stomp down on it hard. It seemed more likely the mage hadn't noticed where he was putting his feet rather than acting in malice. Race's wings were already so badly damaged that he hardly even noticed. "Go to sleep," Race agreed, slurring his voice. "After what you've done here today, you might never sleep again," the Dragon Man replied. "Go to sleep," Race insisted in a slightly stronger voice. It was more instinct than anything. Race turned the comment into a spell, making a gesture with his hand as he spoke. Suddenly there was a stunned look on the Dragon Man's face. He fell forward and landed hard across Race's chest. Race's damaged wings cried out in pain and forced him to grit his teeth. The Dragon Man was down, but not dead, and Race was still helpless and surrounded by enemy soldiers. He could cast Heal on himself, but that wouldn't heal his broken bones. He could cast Regenerate, assuming he could get it right, but considering the pain he was in, that seemed unlikely. First, though, he'd need to sit up. He had to get his wings out from the dirt so that they would repair properly. Somehow, with all the enemy soldiers around him, he doubted he had the time. He lay there, closed his eyes, and waited for the blow that would send him to the next world. That blow didn't come. The elven bodyguards suddenly seemed to be quite busy with other concerns. Having run out of arrows, the Harpies had charged into them and were now fighting them one-on-one. The elves outnumbered the Harpies by at least 6-1, but the Harpies seemed to be getting the upper hand. Only the strongest of elves could wear the armour of an Inquisitor's bodyguard, and even then it greatly slowed their ability to manoeuvre. Normally, that wasn't a problem, as long as they did their job the way it was intended. They weren't supposed to engage in melee combat, they were merely supposed to act as a wall to protect their walls. Indeed, they were only armed with short swords. Even their huge shields were useless when it came to melee combat. It must have been a fine battle. Race would have loved to see it. 140 angry Harpies, probably a few less since Race couldn't be sure of the exact number, flying headlong into battle against 3 regiments of elves and the remaining Inquisitor bodyguards. For a short while the battle seemed to be being fought right over him. He was vaguely aware of the mage's bodyguards leaving their shields stuck in the ground and trying to fend off their attackers. Race also had the strong feeling that the attackers weren't Harpies. Human soldiers had joined the skirmish in fairly decent numbers. Then, slowly, the sounds of battle faded as it drifted away from his location. He lay there, feeling helpless, with no idea who had won or even if any of his girls were still alive. He was dimly aware that someone had picked him up. His every joint cried out in anguish as he was lifted from the ground. He forced himself to open his eyes, and by the look of it, he was being carried by 4 soldiers wearing the uniform of the Moth. At least the right side had won. He began to think of Gagara. His body was shattered and broken, and his first thought was Gagara. He hoped that Gagara was among the survivors. He wasn't sure he wanted to recover if it should turn out that she was among the fallen. Perhaps it was just wishful thinking, but he thought he saw the face of Gagara looking worriedly down at him. There was a very concerned look on her face. When he lost his battle for consciousness. When he came to a relatively short while later, he could hear people talking and assumed it was about him. She fought well, someone said. Race had the feeling it might even have been Gagara, though somehow that seemed doubtful. We shall honour her passing. She isn't dead, someone else replied. There was a particular quality about this voice that Race couldn't mistake. That was his sister's voice. Her wings are shattered, said the first. She might as well be dead. I can fix that easily, the Jenny-like voice commented. I can heal all of your wounded. It's not normally done. A wounded huntress is considered a liability, but if you can save her life, if you can make her as good as new, then I'd be eternally grateful. Now that was definitely Gagara speaking. Just give me a minute, the Jenny voice replied. Elves! Someone shouted a warning. Cavalry! There was suddenly a lot of activity. Race could do nothing but lie there helplessly, while the soldiers engaged in the battle against a new threat. He could hear the twang of arrows and the clash of arms, but he found it hard to even turn his head towards the action. Even the act of trying was enough to make him black out in pain. She's conscious again. It was Gagara talking. Race opened his eyes and looked up at the girl he loved. He hadn't realised he had passed out again until she had spoken. He tried to offer his wife an affectionate smile, but his mouth refused to respond. Jenny was by his side in an instant. Stay calm, Race, she said in a reassuring tone. I'll have you back on your feet again in no time. Then she rested a hand lightly on his forehead, and another down by his navel. Wings, Race muttered weakly. He was still lying on his wings. If she cast a spell now, they might not mend properly. Surely she knew that and would turn him over. Yes, Jenny said soothingly, switching easily to the harpy tongue. I'm going to fix them for you. Underneath, Race tried to point out. It's okay, Jenny cooed. Then she started to channel power through herself and into him. Race gritted his teeth. The breaking of his bones had hurt so much that it had sent him to the very edge of consciousness. The mending of his bones through the use of magic seemed to send the whole process in reverse and hurt almost as much. Race could feel his ribs as they began to knit themselves back together. Then, as the power spread through his wings, they too began to repair themselves. Eventually the magic spread to his head. All the damage that had been done to his skull as he was being dragged along the ground was slowly being repaired. Race found he was able to think a lot more clearly. He was able to keep his eyes open without having to fight to stay conscious. He was able to articulate himself properly. The pain that had come with the injuries seemed to ebb away into nothing as his body was healed as good as new. Race sat up. You need to rest, Jenny told him. Give it 24 hours or so before you try and do anything strenuous again. We don't have that kind of time, Race commented. He tried to flap his wings and found that they moved quite naturally. They hadn't been regenerated out of shape just because he had been lying on them as he had first feared. I have to get everyone to Arlis, remember? I wish I understood what you were saying. It was King Goatee who spoke. I guess I'm going to have to learn that language for myself if I wish to remain on friendly terms with these harpies. Once we've dealt with the elves. Sorry, love, Jenny replied to him. I thought it was more important for the harpies to know what I was saying, since Race is their chief. How goes the evacuation? Race asked of the king. Nearly done, the king said. All the peasants are safe now. We've just started to move the soldiers into the painting. Your brother and Duke Ganespa went in with the rest of the knights. It won't be much longer until Daffodil and I take our turn. Jenny, Jenny hissed. Then she added, there's been no sign of any other elves, not since they sent in the cavalry. Cavalry? Race commented. He didn't remember any cavalry attack and assumed he must have slept through it. How long have I been out? Close to 2 hours, Gagara told him. It was a great battle. You should have seen it. The elven cavalry came charging in and the human archers shot them out of their saddles before they got within 100 feet. They probably thought they were going to catch us unprepared, Jenny commented. Hopefully we've bought ourselves the time we need. They'll organise a proper attack before they come again, the king said in agreement. But by then we ought to be long gone. If we're not, they'll slaughter us, Jenny replied. Race turned his attention to Samigi, who was settled beside him and watching him. She rested an arm gently against the stomach and patted her lightly. Glad to see you make it. Where are my other bodyguards? Quinagoff is fine. She lost her tail in the battle, but now she has a new one, Samigi replied happily. Then she indicated Jenny and added, thanks to this human. Tinegi? Race asked. Over here, boss, came a reply from just a short distance away. Race turned towards the voice. Tinegi had found or created a small mound of earth and was sitting on it. Her legs were crossed as if she was relaxing, but she was leaning forward a little, showing that she really had been quite concerned about Race's condition. What about Heshkov? Race asked, looking back at Samigi. Samigi lowered her head. She didn't make it. We lost 38 huntresses in all during that battle, and Heshkov was one of them. I'm sorry, Race confided. 38 was a large chunk of his village. It left him with merely 100 huntresses, assuming they were still willing to fight for him after the day. It could have been worse. They could have been wiped out. She died in battle trying to protect her male, Tinegi gulped consolingly. It's the way we'd all like to go. I can almost hear Quinagoff telling me that I shouldn't have been in that battle in the first place. That way I wouldn't have needed rescuing, Race commented. He climbed slowly to his feet, testing his newly healed limbs on the rough, uneven ground. "She'd be right," Tanegi commented. "If you hadn't been there, their mage wouldn't have been able to grab you, and we would have gotten away with far fewer casualties." Perhaps you're right. Even though he had been lying on a canvas stretcher, he felt the need to brush himself down. Then he looked about the field. Except for the corpses that now littered the area, the place really did look quite empty. There were still a few regiments of soldiers waiting to be sent into the painting, but otherwise that was pretty much it. Race could see Mangros moving to the front of one of the Romanian regiments. The soldiers were standing in strict, disciplined lines. Each man stood with a hand resting on the shoulder of the man in front. Those in the very front line of the regiment couldn't all be touching their captain at the same time, so instead they rested a hand lightly on the shoulder of their neighbour, with only the man standing immediately behind the regiment's captain resting his hand on the captain's shoulder. And hence the entire regiment was connected. It was then a simple matter for the captain of the regiment to place his hand flat against the painting and utter a few pre-learned words. Suddenly he and everyone in his regiment disappeared. Mangros moved on to the next regiment. With so few troops left on the field, now would be a very bad time for the elves to come again. Race wasn't sure there were enough soldiers left to put up much of a fight. "I think you and the king had better get ready," Race said to Jenny. "We will soon," Jenny replied. "Goatee and I will go in last. It's good for the morale of the men to know that if the elves do try anything, we'll be here with them." "Can you take Samigi with you?" Race asked. "Samigi?" Jenny commented. "Isn't she one of your bodyguards?" "She is," Race said. "She's also nearly 5 months pregnant. I don't want her to have to fly so far in her condition. I'll still have Quenegov, Tanegi and Gagara to watch my back." "She won't like it, handsome," Gagara commented. "I know," Race replied, "but I'll feel a lot happier knowing she isn't putting her unborn baby at risk. She can return as my bodyguard once she's had her child." "Well, Race," the king said, "Jenny trusts you because you're her brother. I trust you because you're my brother-in-law. But there are many people who think I am mad to trust the future of our race to a harpy. Don't let me down." "You can trust us," Race assured the king. King Goatee rested an arm gently on Race's shoulder. He smiled and then turned to his wife. "Come, sweetheart, we have a painting to jump into." "Samigi," Race said, "I want you to travel inside the painting with the others." "But Chief," Samigi protested, "I need someone I can trust to keep an eye on Tifreg, ensure she doesn't let her power go to her head." "Don't worry, you won't miss the big battle," Race assured her, wishing he could keep her from any danger, at least until her baby was born. Samigi nodded. "I'll hold you to that promise."